My name's Aaron Brown. It's also on the screen. This is a group where I can get in some trouble because I have nothing to tell you forestry related that people here probably don't already know. And so I'm much more likely to embarrass myself than not, but I like that kind of challenge. What I'm going to try to tell you of value today is maybe a little bit about how I work in the media and how forestry topics so often enter the public sphere, and how perhaps you, as subject matter experts, might better project your message and just some perspective on my experiences writing about the topics that you work with. So that's the plan for today. I did make a little PowerPoint, but I'm going to share that now if I have the rights. I think I do. That's me. And just real quick background, many of you were more familiar with my work than even I expected. I have a background in media. I've worked in the media since I was 16, actually, as an overnight disc jockey at Cherry High School. Those of you in northern Minnesota might know WEVE, Eveleth, Minnesota. Not too hard, not too soft, just right. That was our thing. Adult contemporary, which in the 1990s meant a lot of Michael Bolton, a lot of Kenny G, and so if you want a little snapshot of me in school, it's a much oilier version of myself. It's 3 a.m. Michael Bolton is playing, and I'm doing my math homework in the studio. Um, it was a weird way to get into the media, but it worked. I then went to school for journalism, worked in newspaper, worked in some radio, and it kind of bounced around between radio and print, and then teaching. Actually, for the bulk of the last 20 some years, 21 years, I was a teacher at Minnesota North College in Hibbing, formerly Hibbing Community College, now part of the 6 campuses of Minnesota North, which include campuses in Ely, Virginia, Eveleth, Grand Rapids, International Falls, and Hibbing. I think I got 6 there. And so my background was in teaching public speaking and communication. So that might have some applications today as well in terms of how to construct messaging as well. That's my background. And I mean, again, I know everybody here has been in the woods and knows a thing or two. And I was raised in the Sax-Zim Swamp of northern Minnesota, which is one of the more ecologically interesting places, maybe in the state, but also in the continent. I think a lot of people have it on their radar because of migratory birds, because of the enormous amount of peatland that's in the Sax-Zim bog. Anyway, I didn't know anything about any of that growing up. We ran a junkyard, Brown and Son Salvage on Highway 7, and the natural world was not something that was presented with a lot of authority uh, when I was growing up. It was mostly oil spills and wrecked cars and cubes of steel leaving the facility. That was my background. But right now, after all these years of working in the media, back in the early 2000s, or mid 2000s, we moved out here where I am now in Balsam Township, Itasca County, and I'm actually surrounded on all sides by managed forest, actually Blandon Paper Company land. And so, and being here 20 years, we've seen the different 40s logged in their sequence, and so that was that gave a really specific understanding of how a managed forest can work. The space directly across from us was logged the year after we built this house. So we built a house in the woods. The next year they cleared all the trees out. I just remember there was a day when like there was a bear and like a legion of raccoons and other things that poured through our property because they had just started logging this land. Well, now, as you know, the land is the forest is regenerating, and the animals are back in the woods, and this system that I didn't understand very well when I moved out here is a little more comprehensible to me. In fact, though I am no expert, my son, my oldest son, is a forestry major or a natural resources forestry major at Stevens Point right now, going into his senior year. Hopefully, among the ranks of um, you all in your various work. He'll be looking for work in about 14 months. So, you know, so he loved growing up in the forest, and he loved nature, and he loved trees. He loves trees more than people. He'd probably tell you that. And yet he went into a field that is, works hand in hand, not, with logging and paper and other things too. And he's kind of this is kind of a world we live in and understand. But I will say most people uh, don't know much about that. I know a little, just like I said, just enough to be dangerous. But most people don't know much, and we're kind of as human beings. As I teach this in class as well when I talk about public speaking. We are a species that is built on stories. Our cultural stories are very important to us, no matter what your culture is. We do better, we seem to have a better time when we share cultural stories and understanding. We feel more in touch with our fellow people when we can share some aspect of our story that is distinct and shared. And the story that got my attention as I became what I call a histrotainer. Like I heard someone said they weren't quite a forester, or a couple of you did actually. I'm not quite a historian, but as I also was said, I play one on TV. I started doing historical research as a journalism major, and did enough of it that now they ask me about historical topics, and I pretend to kind of know what I'm doing. But in my study of northern Minnesota history, which is shared with a lot of the areas like Michigan and Wisconsin and Vermont, I heard really the you have to think of the big woods, the great forest of the continent, the white pine dominated forest that existed at the time of colonization. And this print by Josh Winkler is absolutely, I don't know why I like it so much. It maybe it's I've heard some people say to me it's not that spectacular, but I just love it because of the detail of the tall white pines that actually you can see through when you're down on the ground, but that form a canopy that you can't see through above. You got undergrowth, you've got areas where certain things can grow. You see the moss, you see a forest, a fully mature forest that had endured for hundreds of years. And it's what captivates me about it is that it's gone. I mean, there are still white pines and there are still forests, and there are even wildernesses in certain places, but not like this forest. And that really captivated me. Actually, before I found that print or endeavored to understand what that forest looked like, I read this quote from a gentleman from Hibbing, who was speaking at a gathering of, first pioneers. They used to have these gatherings of the people who first moved to towns when towns were formed on the Mesabi Iron Range, and they'd have these pioneer groups. And Giffen was speaking to one of these pioneer groups in 1930, and he was talking about something he had seen 39 years earlier in 1891. And he had climbed a hill, a tall hill near Mountain Iron, in Minnesota, where they, of course, later became, mined out from mining activity. But at the time, it was still this forest, and he remembered seeing a veritable ocean of pine, he said, inexhaustible, enough to last for ages, and he adds, as I thought at the time. And again, I'm telling you stuff that you know that That forest was not, in fact, inexhaustible. It was exhaustible, and it was exhausted relatively quickly, in just 10 years, really. I mean, it depends on where you are. Out east, it was earlier. Southern Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, then they finally got into northern Minnesota, the Upper Peninsula, into places that they used to think were impossible to get to. um, they got to all of it. They figured it out, and because the value of the resource was so great, and that really was a story. The idea of an inexhaustible resource was a story that was very pervasive in how people thought about the big woods, the forest, of North America, and it dominated our cultural thinking about the woods, for generations back in the 19th and early 20th century. And then, as I point out in another talk that I do, and I'm not going to go into all the details, they cut it down, and we lived in what I call a world of stump and slash. The other thing that I found in my historical research, from the early 20th century, which is a period that I research, um, is a period of fascination because of the early towns of the Mesabi Iron Range, which often get a lot of attention for their labor and mining and immigration activity. But we're also instrumental in a lot of things, and actually they kind of combine into a really nice story that I'm working on for a book that I hope will be out, I'll say, next year. Still working on the edits, which are substantial because if you can't tell, I do enjoy telling stories and will gather more information than I need, and tell stories that don't need to be told at length, as needed. So, working on that. But that period was really interesting because, to me, because of the stories that were told. And I was really researching this period of, it's all here. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. In the early 1900s, 1915, 1920, particularly by 1920, this inexhaustible, endless forest was gone, and it was a world of stumps. And particularly in that period, guess what? You all know that the 1918 fires in Minnesota occurred, which were a direct outcropping of the way the forest was managed at that time, which was to be cut down, stumps left behind, slash left behind, a lot of detritus left all over the woods, not a lot of effort or attention paid to regeneration, and just a tremendous amount of fuels laying around, in what then became a very dry and dangerous fire condition, such that 100 years later, 107 years later, at least here in the state of Minnesota, though probably everywhere, we are still haunted in many ways by those fires. And when we see the fires in Canada, when we see the fires out west, when we see fires in our own states, we react with a fear that I think comes just like I don't know what kid ever got a razor blade in their Halloween candy, but there was one apparently, and now we live in utter terror coast to coast of razor blades in the Halloween candy. And so that was like the Minnesota fires of 1918, this just horrible event that really shaped, everything that would come. So that's the story of the cut down, and there's a few different ways that this story was interpreted. I'm sharing our friend Paul Bunyan, and Babe the Blue Ox, not real people or oxen for that matter. They uh, they are a myth, and yes, there's a storytelling tradition in logging camps where Paul Bunyan may have originated from, but whoever Paul Bunyan was based on, the line has long been stretched beyond into the notion of a folk figure that's enormous and can walk over treetops with his boots. And I mean, who makes those boots, honestly? Did we ever think about that? Like, look at those boots. So that's a lot of cows. Or maybe just Babe's old friend. I don't know. But the myth of Paul Bunyan was kind of the world that, if you grew up in the late 20th century, you got a kind of a Paul Bunyan story about the past. You got oh yeah, there was a lot of trees and we cut a lot of them down, and that was the past and it was all necessary, and it became kind of an easy way to explain to kids just the vastness of what human beings did during that period. Some of the irresponsibility, which is hard to explain, because the very best minds in the world were all on board with cutting those trees down. And it built a lot of stuff, and we want to enjoy the things that we built. And so it's the Paul Bunyan story kind of softened. It was a myth that was there not just to be fun for kids, but to kind of soften and sell a notion of what we did back there, and making it okay, and without having to think about it much. um, I always feel with the study of history that um, it's a study of ruining your favorite stories as you dig into it more. There are great historical stories, don't get me wrong, but if you go in with kind of a gauzy notion that the past was this great land of opportunity and hard work, and good, only good things happened back there, and look at us today and our whatever you think is wrong with society today, and I learned that the actual study of history is a pretty good way to dispel a lot of myth. And not that these scenes are, I just include these, I had these pictures in another slide, but again, just reiterating the vastness of a river drive after winter, and you see all these logs in a river heading down to the mill, and you can imagine not only how hard it is to to get all those logs in there, but imagine the people, like some of the people pictured on the right, who have to ride those logs to keep the logs flowing, and the danger involved in their lives. I just pointed this out in a talk yesterday that we have those timber sports, you can watch on ESPN 5 or 6, and you can watch people run on the logs, and they can run pretty long time, and they might even win a prize or something if they do it a long time. But in the 1800s, or early 1900s, but mostly in the late 1800s, uh people had to do that, but if they fell off, they didn't just lose a contest, they probably died. And so just, I realize that it's kind of dark to point this out, but it is just a fact of how dangerous and challenging it was, and really, I like to point out that people can do anything. They can do a lot of things, maybe not anything, but the human race is very capable of doing a vast number of amazing things, and it can be good or bad. And it can be safe or not. And people can sacrifice their lives for commerce in a very simple, direct way, as people did in the woods, in the mines of the past. And so there's a story to be told in what we learned from all of that as well. Here's a story that I think you all should be telling, and that I've been told, and you probably do tell this story, is the rise of conservation as a tool. And you can look at just a couple of images that I have here, the images of what Theodore Roosevelt did during his administration to enhance and build national forests. And then down below is the Biltmore Estate, the first the earliest research on forestry, as we would now call it, was conducted on this palatial estate in North Carolina. And what was learned there was, in the late 1800s and very early 1900s, was then shared and informed people like Teddy Roosevelt and others. And I realize that we've moved on to a large degree from some of the earlier notions of how forestry is. We've continued to learn. It's a developing, growing science. But we can at least look back and remark that if you look back at where we were, and what was done to where we are, That in 100 years ago, 110, 120 years ago, um, people were doing things finally to restore and sustain our forests in a better way, incomplete perhaps, but it was still a better way of conserving the land and conserving the resource on the land for a long period of time. So, looking at that, we can then look forward. What do we do now? What do we do now with telling a new story in the 21st century? I suppose I can. This is mostly just me chatting now. But one of the things that I would suggest is looking at the ways that, because it used to just be logging, and specifically logging for timber or for lumber or for, and then later for paper products. And we know that we still use those products and will in indefinitely in the future. But we also know that it's bigger than that in some ways. We are managing forests for other kinds of products, and we're also managing forests for carbon storage, and managing, for larger environmental reasons than just the products, though the products remain a big part of it. So I think one of the things I would suggest to the audience is making the management of our forests part of the stories that media people cover on a regular basis, not just when there's a fire. And there are fires, we know that. There will be fires, and there are, reasons to worry about the frequency and duration and severity of the fires. But I think it would be helpful for the public to understand how fires really work, why they happen. Um, and I've done some reporting and editorializing on that. It is frustrating. It's frustrating, when the smoke gets thick, as it did yesterday. Was one of the worst. I don't know how you all were, but one of the worst smoke days I've experienced in northern Minnesota. I was driving up from Crosby back home to north of Nashwauk, and you couldn't see the horizon for the smoke. There's a lot of farm country and hay fields and peat fields down there, and it just looked like fog. And I forgot to turn the outside vents off on my van, so I was inhaling a lot. I actually had a headache, like, and in that environment that everybody in this very divided and often misinformed world gets to breathe the smoke, but they get to have their own ideas about why they are. Everyone has their own opinion about that. And I think there's something important to be done there to explain where the smoke's coming from, why it's not, this is again me. I'm an opinion columnist, so I can say opinions, but I don't think it's as easy as telling Canada to flip a switch from smoke to no smoke. They are dealing with a forest that is very different than our United States forests, if only because they are so remote and so vast compared to a lot of what we manage here in the United States. And that's not to say that they or us have a perfect forestry policy, just that we have to deal with the world as it is, and that would be something important. One example I'll give you. I recently wrote a column about. It was actually about mining, but I got to take an airplane ride above the Mesabi Iron Range to look at the mines of this region, the iron mines. And I was mostly looking at really the size and scope of the mining activity, which is vast, vast, vast. We know that if you live here or if you pass through here, but it's really from above, you don't really get a clear sense of it until you see it that way. But one of the other things I saw was where there were some forest fires earlier in the season, from springtime. I'm already blanking on the names of them, but there were fires basically north of Duluth and south of Ely, kind of in south of Babbitt, and I got to see maybe a month or two, 6 weeks after they had them contained. And here's a fact that surprised me that was visible from above. They didn't look that bad, because again, dangerous. I'm talking to people who know more than I do. Because those fires had spread mostly through the canopy of the trees, um, there was a lot of green coming up underneath after just 6 weeks to 8 weeks. There was a lot of things happening, regenerative things happening, right there on the spot where they had crews working. In fact, where people lost their homes and some other things, not 2 months earlier. And so that was eye opening. And I don't know that. Well, it's really hard. You have everybody's attention when there's a massive 1,000-acre fire that's threatening houses. You got everybody's attention. They'll watch the news and they'll follow on their phones to find out where that fire is going. But after the fire is gone, is finally out, you have a much harder task of telling a story about what that fire did and what it meant in terms of the long-term management. And then perhaps another explanation of how that fire is different than some of the, really damaging, deep, hot fires that they've seen up in Canada that have, maybe decimated the landscape more than they should have, and from a natural standpoint, because of the dry and particularly dangerous fire conditions in other parts of the continent. And we've had those out west, we've seen this as well. So you see that there's a story to tell here, but it's a little more complicated to get the eyes on it, to get attention. And that's one of the challenges we as people who care about forests, but also just both from your standpoint, from the forester's standpoint, from the forestry organizational standpoint, you're trying to get information out about this. And from my standpoint, I write about everything. I'm writing about, this morning, the column I wrote is about the troll sculptures in Detroit Lakes. I'm working on a column about the post-secondary enrollment option program for the weekend. I've got veterinary care, I've got healthcare topics, and mining, of course, because of where I am. And then occasionally I'll get to talk about forestry. I'm a generalist. Journalism majors are the most dangerous because we have just enough ability to convey a slim notion of expertise. That's our ability, is to project expertise. But we're covering so many different things, writing about so many different things, that we're really tuned to scanning for the great story. And then the other thing, like human beings, journalists are attracted to the comfortable. And one of the things that's always comfortable is, what topics do you write about? Well, the more comfortable you are with a topic, like I can whip out a mining column in a couple hours, no problem. Well, just ask me what's going on right now, and I'll tell you something that someone might read, just because I've covered it so long and I've seen a lot about it. But if you're talking about a topic that you don't know as well, you got to talk to a lot more people. So I'd say one of the things about dealing with media, and of course the media is a dirty word in so many corners, uh, but media is fundamentally a plural word. There are many parts of the media, and generally, I hope you would recognize, or hope everyone would recognize, that they're human beings conducting their jobs who compose the media as it is. And generally speaking, if you're relating with those people in a way that they can process, they're going to be interested and attracted to your stories. And that's something that came across in a couple pieces I've written recently. Um, I think, again, opinion on my part, I think that we're entering a period where the control and the control and rights and privileges extended to land are going to be very important in our world. Who controls our public lands? What can people do on those public lands? Who controls and dictates what happens to our water and other resources that maybe for a long time we've kind of taken for granted, maybe just raised in a time of plenty without a lot of without a lot of hardship relative to other parts of the world or parts of our own history. And so I think that central to this is going to be forest management and forestry, not only because not just because of the logs and the wood products, but because of control and power and who is allowed to use land even recreationally, and what kind of revenue is generated from that land and who gets it and how much of it. The story that I'm writing about from northern Minnesota is a historical story about the village of Hibbing, which is mostly about taxation. It's a story about taxation, which is boring, right? It's incredibly boring, but the story in this case is really about power to control people's lives and livelihoods. Yes, surrounding a natural resource, in this case, iron ore, but I do talk about timber and other things in that story. Um, uh, but it's a story of people exerting their power over, um, you know, uh, the resources and how power concentration was then the big story. One company, in this case US Steel, dictating terms to an elected democratic government, local government, dictating terms to other businesses, dictating terms to larger governments, and influencing federal and state policies to their liking. And so, in that context, we have to look at today and say, well, obviously that battle, that discussion or debate, or however you want to phrase it, isn't over, because we're still having that debate over who has a say in how this all turns out. And it's not so easy to determine. So I guess I'll leave it there. I hope that that was at least a moderately engaging discussion starter.